Apparently, it was Betty Davis who said, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night." I never knew that, although I'm kind of half an authority on Betty Davis and her eyes. I made up the "fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy ride" entirely by myself. But in homage to the great Hollywood film star, I've changed it to use her words instead. This show this evening, the midweek mother of all talk shows, which, listen in for the nuggets, has overtaken the mothership, the Sunday night mother of all talk shows, in viewership, at least in the last week or so. This is brought to you by our wonderful sponsor in the first hour, 220 km. Our good friend Ravi Gudkakathan, who is the author of some of the finest cosmetic products that it's ever been my good fortune to come across, and is about to turn them into foodstuff. That's how pure they are. My good friend Ravi has sponsored the show these last few weeks and is going to go on doing so. And he'll be joined in the second hour by a second sponsor, but more about them later. Benjamin Netanyahu is back. Words you never thought you'd be glad to hear. But when you see who'll be in government with him, you'll realize that the polarity in Israeli politics now is between Netanyahu, who wants a low body count in the occupied territories, whilst facts are created on the ground, rendering the once famous two-state solution null and void, entirely otiose, and people who want to show the Arabs who the real lords of the land are. That quote is directly from the Kahanist leader, Gever, who will be the power in Netanyahu's government. In fact, he wants to take Netanyahu's place, which may, of course, lead to tensions, which may, of course, lead to the collapse of the government and more elections. But a fat lot of good that will do, because the direction of travel is absolutely clear. The once mighty Labour Party, which founded the state of Israel, which governed the state of Israel, throughout its existence for at least 25 years, is now reduced to 4 members of parliament in a parliament of 120 members. Netanyahu already has 65 MPs, which by Israeli standards is a landslide victory, and they haven't stopped counting yet. The so-called left-wing Meretz, a pro-Zionist but kind of vaguely leftish group, has failed to make the threshold, as has Balad, the Israeli Arab, as they call them, the Palestinian slate of candidates. They have failed to make the threshold also. So it's going to be a parliament where Netanyahu is the moderate voice in government. That's how bleak the situation is. We'll take calls, of course, on that subject and discuss it perhaps more fully when we can on Sunday. The Middle East powder keg is as explosive as ever. Atop the Great Mosque in Qum in Iran, a red flag has been raised. Not the red flag of socialist revolution, but the red flag of retaliation. The last time it was hoisted was on the assassination of very important people in the era of the Donald Trump administration. The flag of retaliation means what it says on the tin. It means that Iran is getting ready to retaliate against those that it holds responsible for the massacre of pilgrims by a mass murderer claimed by ISIS but believed in Iran to have been the work of Saudi Arabia next door. The Saudi Arabian government has told the American government that they expect an Iranian attack on them imminently. The Americans, notwithstanding their recent difficulties with the Saudi government, have said that they are ready to intervene. What could possibly go wrong? A Saudi-American war against Iran, with its ever-growing closeness to both Russia and China, and the existence of 88 million people in Iran, virtually every one of whom would rally to the flag. The massacre in Shiraz was so horrific and so irreligious, so sacrilegious, that it has managed to unify millions of Iranians, tens of millions of Iranians, onto the streets of their country in support of their government in whatever it does next. As if we didn't have enough war, of course, the Middle East is a sideshow these days compared to, for example, North Korea, which has just fired at least a dozen ballistic missiles so far into the Sea of Japan that they could well have landed in the center of Tokyo. Japan, of course, being the traditional enemy of Korea after Japan invaded, occupied, mass murdered and raped its people in the 1930s and 40s. But of course, South Korea is the creation of the post-war era, the United States, a puppet state in the region, and South Korea has placed its forces on emergency alert. A war on the Korean Peninsula would be a sideshow compared to the big war that is still raging in the heart of Europe. I've stopped calling it the Ukraine war now. It was, for a time, the Ukraine war since it began in 2014. We'll be talking to a celebrated filmmaker in a minute or two about that. When it started in 2014, it was a Ukrainian civil war. You might say, at least you could argue, I wouldn't, that the Russian intervention in Ukraine, in the eastern part of the country, to defend its co-religionists, its compatriots, its fellow Russians in eastern Ukraine, was also a Russia-Ukraine war. You could argue that, though I would say NATO has taken Ukraine as a protectorate from at least 2014, maybe even before. But now it's not a Russia-Ukraine war at all. If you study, as I have been studying, the deaths of Ukrainian, in inverted commas, service personnel in the recent battles in Ukraine, you'll see an inordinate number of Polish names. You'll see, when they're published online, you won't see them in the fake stream media, an inordinate number of Polish passports retrieved from the dead bodies of Polish fighters. There are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of Polish and a smaller amount of Romanian forces already fighting at the front line in the war in Ukraine. But the big news this week was that the Pentagon confirmed for the first time that there are American forces now with their boots on the ground in Ukraine. The proximate reason for that is that they have to guard the American weapons that have been sent in such profusion into the battlefield, into the maw that this war has become, even before General Winter arrives. But of course, that places them directly in the firing line, because a very significant proportion of arriving NATO weaponry in Ukraine is immediately blown up by the Russian armed forces, who are themselves now arriving on the battlefield in increasing numbers, both in quantity and in quality. The Russians are now fighting according to their own military doctrine. No more ragbag of militiamen and gendarmes. This is now the real Russian army on the battlefield. And that Russian army will increase its targeting of NATO weaponry now that they know, thanks to the Pentagon, that that weaponry is escorted by American military personnel. So what happens when the first caliber missile blows up an entire platoon of official American forces on the ground in Ukraine? Well, I'm not Einstein, I'm not in possession of a crystal ball, but I think I can work out what happens next. And it's not a pretty sight. The seeding of new US nuclear missiles throughout all of its satrapies in Europe is a matter, or ought to be, of grave concern. In Western countries, most people don't even know that it has happened. Only those that follow military affairs with any degree of closeness are aware that the US has massively reinforced its nuclear strike force throughout the NATO countries, including my own here in Great Britain. But the farther you go, the closer you get to the Russian border, those missiles exist more thickly. And so the scene is being set for a series of conflicts around the world, which may be the final Armageddon. It may be that the end times will be upon us, in which case say your prayers, hug your children close, for the end is nigh. Unless somebody somewhere can see sense and draw us back from the brink of this catastrophic ending to humanity, indeed to the ending of all life on this beautiful planet that God gave us and which we have enjoyed for so many years, and the other living beings on this earth have enjoyed for many aeons. That person might be the Turkish President Erdogan. You never thought you'd hear me saying that. But he is the only person that is proactively seeking a negotiated end to this conflict. He has today again iterated that he will not allow Sweden to join NATO unless Sweden complies with a series of Turkish demands that it cannot, under its own law, comply with, namely the repatriation of Kurdish terrorist suspects that Turkey wishes to try. This is not possible for Sweden to do, so Sweden won't be joining NATO. Neither, in that case, I'll hazard a guess, will Finland. So 1-0 to Mr. Erdogan. Mr. Erdogan has brokered a return of Russia to the grain deal that was allowing grain from Ukraine to pass out through Sebastopol and into international markets, not, as was claimed, to feed poor people in poor countries. That was all a ruse, because most of that grain goes to Britain and Ireland, about which more later. But Russia pulled out because Ukraine attacked the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, in Sebastopol, using a corridor that had been effectively demilitarized for the purposes of allowing the grain to flow into the international markets. But Erdogan has talked the Russians back into the grain deal. 2-0 for Mr. Erdogan. And this evening, Erdogan has announced that he has talked little soldier Schulz, the pretender to power in Germany, into a shared view that he, Erdogan, has been expounding, that the Europeans, the Turks, and the Russians have to begin to start finding a common language between them. You may say that that's a very small step indeed. But it's a big step forward from where little soldier Schultz was just yesterday, when he actually threatened Serbia. By the way, Schultz, not a good idea for German leaders to threaten Serbia. They gave you a bloody good hiding the last time you came calling. But Schultz threatened Serbia just yesterday that they had to choose between the EU and Russia. Today, he's agreed with Erdogan that some common language, some common way forward must be found with President Vladimir Putin. That is, if Putin survives the latest news from Associated Press that he's got both pancreatic cancer and Parkinson's disease. That's on top of the lung cancer, brain cancer, stroke, and actual death that he has suffered over the last 8 months. But assuming President Putin survives all of these hideous ailments, if Erdogan has his way, we will be talked down off the cliff, off the bridge, below which the raging torrents seek to sweep us all away. So full marks, Mr. Erdogan. And I never thought that I would be saying that on the mother of all talk shows. In the time available to me, let me explain why I'm still going on about poor Paul Pelosi, who got hammered in his underpants in Nancy Pelosi's palatial home in San Francisco. I don't mean, of course, that he got hammered in that he was blind drunk as he was driving a car just a few weeks ago in the state of California. I don't even mean that he was under the influence of cocaine, even though just a few weeks ago he was found with cocaine in his car. That's right, the husband of the number 3 person in the United States was driving with 4 times the allowable level of alcohol in his blood, with cocaine in his glove compartment. Now, in any normal country, that would be really, really big news. But it was scarcely news at all. So when I say he got hammered in his underpants, I mean he literally got hammered in his underpants by a gay, swinging member of the Green Party who is a nudist. And somehow this got turned into a pre-election story by the Democrats against Donald Trump, who, as far as I know, was nowhere near San Francisco and is quite positive about underpant parties himself. He likes to party, Donald Trump. He'd probably get on famously with Paul Pelosi, though he doesn't drink alcohol or take cocaine, so far at least as I know. But whatever else you could say about Donald Trump, a gay, swinging, nudist member of the Green Party from Berkeley, California, is not his fault, is not his responsibility, but the lie machine that is the American fake stream media immediately tried to turn this story into an anti-Republican Party story to try and effect a change in the much speculated landslide defeat that they are going to suffer next week in the midterm elections. That was reason enough for me to raise an eyebrow about poor Paul Pelosi being hammered in his underpants. But there are other reasons. The second thing I read was that the police conceded that they did have security cameras everywhere on and around the Pelosi household. You'd expect that. She is third in line to the presidency after all. But just like in Jeffrey Epstein's jail suicide, the cameras weren't working. The third reason to smell a rat is that As Farron Fronczak told MOATS on Sunday, she was at the house just a couple of weeks ago, not inside it, not having a party, but she passed by it. And it was black with escalades and security forces, as you'd expect it to be. But on this night, they either weren't there or they didn't notice the gay, swinging, nudist Green Party member from Berkeley, California, who was also in his underpants when the police arrived. And the fourth thing, the fourth rat I smelt was, call me Inspector Clouseau, if you like. Boom. But I saw the picture of the French windows through which the gay, swinging, nudist Green Party member from Berkeley, California, was supposed to have entered the house through. Except all the broken glass was on the outside and not the inside. And because of the Epstein story, because of the Hunter laptop story, because of what happened to my good friend Tara Reid with Joe Biden, I no longer automatically believe anything that the American deep state and the Democratic Party in America tell me. I insist on journalism. I insist on skepticism. That is the duty of anyone who calls themselves a journalist. Has that been in evidence in this case so far? Absolutely not. However, the nudist swinger, Green Party member from Berkeley, California, has just pleaded not guilty. And so we have the mother of all trials impending in San Francisco. Fasten your seatbelts. As I said, it's going to be a bumpy night.